In the middle of the night, a black woman was thrown out of the car, pinned to the ground, her hands clenched until they bled. She did not resist. She did not commit any crime. She just stopped to rest after a long work trip. But for that white police officer, her skin color was enough to make the city a threat. No questions. Silence could not be heard. Command, command, handcuffs, take to the field. But this time, the wrong person was chosen. By that woman, not just a citizen. She was a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army who had commanded on the battlefield. And this time, she was not fighting abroad. She was fighting right here on American soil to expose a painful truth. Skin color is the first judgment in the eyes of those who wear the badge. A recording, a secret video, a working event that shook the whole country. Subscribe now because this is not just a story. This is the truth they don't want you to know. And when the truth is washed away, it's our responsibility to dig it up with our voices. Night had fallen like a thick blanket over the quiet streets of suburban Macon, Georgia. Camille Ransom's shiny black SUV rolled slowly under the dim yellow lights, reflecting a pale light on the dewy pavement. The clock on the dashboard read nearly 11 o'clock at night. It was still 30 miles to go before she'd reach home. Not a long way, but with her body exhausted from a 3-day tour, Camille wasn't about to risk it. She'd been through much tougher things. Cross-border journeys, drills in the burning desert, all-nighters in the middle of a battlefield where her guard was never down. But tonight, all she needed was a moment to stop, to straighten her back, take a deep breath, and let her heart rate slow a little. To her left, a small street turned into a residential area. Quiet, neat, with dark trees lining the sidewalks and 2-story houses huddled in an excessive order. Camille turned on her signal, turned in, and stopped the car close to the curb. She turned off the engine, leaned back in her seat, her right hand still gripping the wheel, as if by habit she had never let go. Her left hand reached up to gently rub her neck, where the muscles were as tight as an overstrung guitar string. The night wind blew through the half-open door, carrying the scent of wood, damp earth, and a fragile peace she no longer felt in the crowded city. But Camille did not sleep. She had never fallen asleep at the wheel. For her, alertness was a reflex, like breathing, like blood. As a black woman in the military for nearly 20 years, Camille knew that any slip, even the smallest, could be magnified into a fatal mistake. And then, as she closed her eyes and took a deep breath, the red-blue light behind the car flashed like a knife, slicing through the night. For a split second, Camille's heart slowed, not from panic but from instinctive familiarity. Police lights. No sirens. No speakers. Just the flashing light through the rearview mirror. Cold and cruel. Her hands immediately returned to the 10 o'clock to 2 o'clock position on the wheel, palms open, chin up, eyes looking straight ahead. Every movement as precise as a training exercise. There was nothing strange in the car. No drugs, no weapons, no fake papers. She hadn't broken any laws. And that should have been enough. But Camille knew, with this skin color, in this SUV, in this neighborhood, in the middle of the night, that enough was never enough. Footsteps pounded steadily on the pavement behind the car. Each step was firm, steady, carrying the feeling of someone about to pronounce judgment rather than someone enforcing the law. Camille did not turn around. She heard 2 sharp knocks on the glass. Hard. Not enough to break it, but plenty to apply pressure. "Please roll down your window, ma'am." The man's voice, not high, not harsh, but lacking what any citizen should receive from a police officer. Respect. Camille pressed the button, lowering her window halfway. The wind blew in, and the man came into view. Tall, fair-skinned, his stern face trying to hide his obvious judgment. "I've had a few calls from residents around here," he said, not introducing himself, not flashing a name tag. "There's an unknown car parked outside, making people feel unsafe. Unsafe." The phrase rang in Camille's head like an alarm. No one said she had threatened anyone. No one had accused her of being dangerous. It was just, her presence made people feel uncomfortable. She raised her head, her voice calm. "I've only been parked for a few minutes. I'm taking a break. If necessary, I'll leave." Draper, the officer's name she'd seen on his badge as he leaned forward, did not respond immediately. He craned his neck, peering into the car through the lowered window. Not for safety, for probing. Something. Anything that would make him act without reason. "You don't live in the area, do you?" "No, I'm in Savannah. I just got back from D.C. "Then there's no good reason for you to be parked here." "Not at this hour." Camille didn't respond, but her throat began to tighten. Not with fear, but with the familiar anger that was creeping in. She remembered hearing the phrase so many times. "Not here." No one said it aloud, but everything they did emphasized it. "This is not a roadside rest stop," Draper continued, his voice sarcastic. "This is a private residence." "Yes," Camille said softly. "I understand. I'll be right there." But her eyes didn't drop this time. She held her gaze. Not arrogantly, not evasively, just a look of refusal to be diminished. Draper was not pleased. He took a step back, scanning the street, where no one else had come out, no shouting, no events of note. But perhaps to him, that made him want to assert his power all the more. Because power in the dark was always easier to abuse than in the light of day. "Your license plate was reported to a drug route in Edgewood," Draper said abruptly. No reference, no check. Just words. Camille froze. "I've never been to Edgewood. If my license plate had been reported, my record wouldn't be as clean as it is now." There was an awkward pause. Draper bowed his head, his hand on his belt, where his flashlight, his taser, and more were. "Get out of the car," he said. "I need to search you. If you have nothing to hide, you're fine." And Camille understood. The game had changed. Not because she'd done anything wrong, but because he'd decided that her very existence was a threat, Camille Ransom sat motionless for a few more seconds after hearing the command, "Get out of the car." Not because she hesitated, but because she was weighing the options. On the one hand, unconditional compliance, on the other, the civil rights she had sworn to protect, even with her life. But this time, it was she who needed protecting. Not from the guns and bullets of the border, but from the invisible prejudice that took the form of an officer empowered by the state. She opened her mouth, her voice still holding the calm that years of military service had honed. "I am not refusing to cooperate, but I want to know the specific reason for the search. There is no sign of infraction, no odor, no dangerous behavior, and I have a right to know." Draper took a step closer. The headlights of the patrol car reflected off the windshield, casting a shadow over his face that hid his true intentions. "I don't have to prove it if I felt a threat," he said, emphasizing the word "felt" as if it were a law passed from his lips. Camille swallowed. That phrase, "felt a threat," had become a ticket to countless acts of encroachment, of abuse, of deprivation. In military training, she had learned how a democratic nation handled an emergency. What she hadn't been taught was what to do when that very mechanism became the cause of the emergency. "The police have the authority," Draper continued, "and I don't see any cooperation from you." Camille exhaled slowly, her hands still on the wheel, her knuckles beginning to turn white from the force of her grip. "I didn't move my hands from my sight. I followed the proper procedures. I didn't disobey. But I also know the law." Draper tilted his head, squinting as if she had insulted him. "The law?" he growled. "Are you challenging me?" "No, I'm reminding both of us that the law is not a matter of personal feelings." And that was when it happened. A sudden movement. Draper jerked the handle of the car door. The sound of the latch locking rang out like a silent snap. Before Camille could react, he reached in, grabbed her wrist, and pulled her out with a force so strong and unnecessary it was almost deliberate. "What are you doing?" Camille shouted, her voice losing its composure. "You're resisting." Draper's voice was icy. "You're stalling, and I have the right." She was pushed face down onto the hood, her cheek against the paint still warm from the recent shutdown. Her arms were forced behind her back. The cold metal tightened around her wrists. The handcuffs, the ones she had once worn on criminals on the battlefield, were now tightening around her. Not because she was dangerous, but because the man was reminding her that here, he was the law. "Camille Ransom, you are under arrest for failing to comply with the orders of a police officer," Draper announced in a monotone voice, as if performing a routine task on his to-do list. Camille did not protest, but she did not submit either. She stood straight, her eyes staring straight ahead, her heart pounding not with fear, but with anger. She knew this was not just about her. It was about millions like her. People like her who had been handcuffed for the same reason. Displeasure. On the street, the red and blue traffic lights continued to flash, as if to emphasize that order is being maintained. But who needed protection? And who was considered a threat? Lights flickered in the few windows. Some looked out, some looked away. A door opened slightly. A middle-aged white woman in a robe stood silently on the porch, holding a cup of tea. No one stopped Draper. No one asked if Camille needed help. All they saw was a black woman handcuffed outside her door. And to them, that seemed enough to believe that she must have done something wrong. Their eyes swept over Camille as if she were a piece of trash that needed to be picked up. Draper pushed her into the back seat of the patrol car. The seat was cold. No words, no explanation. The door slammed shut behind her, cutting off any attempt to explain herself to the world. Draper got into the driver's seat, not looking at her, but she saw a half smile in the rearview mirror, not a smile of joy, not of victory, but of satisfaction at having proven who was in charge. The car rolled away. The lights were still on, not because there was an emergency, but because the spectacle needed an audience. Not a felon, but a small parade, a silent message. Everything is under control in this neighborhood. The intruder has been eliminated. Camille didn't turn away. She looked out the window, saw the modern houses, the neat porches, the neatly trimmed lawns, what had once promised to be the American dream. And she thought, maybe to others, this was a dream. But to her, tonight, it was a legalized nightmare. The smell of old leather on the car seat mixed with the metallic scent of the handcuffs made her stomach churn. But she didn't show it. She had stood in the line of fire, survived sandstorms, seen her comrades fall before her eyes. But what made her want to cry now was that she, a person who had dedicated her life to protecting the law, was being suffocated by that very law, by hands cloaked in power but without souls. The metal door of this Macon police station slammed shut behind Camille Ransom. It didn't make a loud sound. It didn't have the long metallic screech of a movie, but the dry click was enough to send a chill down her spine. In her 2 decades of service, she'd walked through many doors of life and death. Armory doors, medical shelter doors, military transport aircraft doors that smelled of sweat and gunpowder, but none had ever been as cold and unfeeling as this, the door of a place called the Guardian of the Law. No one said a word as Draper led her through the hallway. The officers on duty didn't look at her. A female receptionist glanced up from her computer screen, then bowed her head as if Camille were a speck on the floor. No one asked if she was hurt, no paperwork, no protocol, no rules. Only a practiced indifference, the complicit silence of people who were too used to looking the other way. As long as it wasn't their business. Draper nudged Camille's shoulder, leading her left into a smaller hallway, the cold white neon reflecting off her dark skin with a cruel casualness. Camille slowed, just long enough to read the signs along the hallway. Close room 3. No public surveillance. No entry without business. A warning chime tapped at her intuition. She turned her wrists. The cuffs were too tight, starting to bleed red. There are no cameras in this area. She realized that as soon as she stepped into the cell. There was no flashing red light in the ceiling recess. There was no soft panning sound, as in every cell she'd ever trained in or visited on internal duty. No witnesses. and no one intended for anyone to witness. Draper opened the cell door, forced her in, and uncuffed her. No apology, no clear command, just a look of contempt. Camille watched him silently as he turned and walked away, his footsteps slow and deliberate, as if each word was a reminder. I can do anything here, and no one will hear. The door closed. This time the sound it made was no longer metallic. It was one of helplessness. The cell was small, cold, and dark. A fixed metal bench against the wall. No mattress. A steel toilet with no partitions. A gray concrete floor with an unidentifiable damp stain. The smell of antiseptic mixed with rust and old sweat. The smell of people who had been silenced. Camille sat down slowly. Her posture was straight. Her shoulders did not drop. Her back did not bend. The posture of someone who knows they are being watched, even if the camera is not working. She raised her head, looking at the corner of the wall where a steel pipe once held a surveillance camera, now bare and unlit without wires. The cold air from the air conditioning blew through the ceiling, but did nothing to dispel the heaviness of the presence of unchecked power. A chill ran down Camille's spine, not because of the temperature, but because of the question that popped into her head. If something happens to me tonight, who would believe it? Footsteps echoed. The door opened, revealing another stranger this time. No name, no badge, no rank. Tall, fair, with silver hair at the nape of his neck. Eyes colder than the cell. He stepped in, closing the door behind him, looking at her like a beast that did not roar, but was still dangerous. "Camille Ransom," he began, his voice low but deliberately echoing against the bare walls. "I hear people like you think they're victims." Camille didn't answer. He stepped closer, leaned over, and pressed his thumb firmly against her right wrist, the same spot where the handcuffs had been tightened less than 10 minutes ago. She winced, flinching back reflexively, but her eyes never left him. "Does it hurt?" he asked, smirking. "Are you that weak for a soldier?" "You're not a doctor," Camille replied, her voice as even as wire. He straightened. "I don't need to be a doctor. I'm here to keep order." Camille raised her head, her eyes now shining with a slight challenge. Not fierce, but enough for anyone with eyes to see. This woman was no longer a victim. She was taking it all in. He turned his head, glanced around the corner and smiled faintly. "No cameras, no evidence, and believe me, no one cares. No one out there wants to know why someone like you is here." Camille didn't answer. But in her head, a small sound rang out, not a cry for help, but a beep. A beep from the old phone hidden in the inner pocket of her thick coat, still recording the sound from when Draper pushed her into the car. With the survivor's intuition of someone who had been in the middle of a battlefield, Camille had started the recording as soon as the police car's lights came on. And now, with her palm resting on her knee, her fingers moved gently, pressing the second lock button. A silent signal was sent to the remote personal computer storage. The recording would be protected. She still said nothing, but her face had changed. No longer afraid, no more resentment. Only one feeling remains. The evidence has begun to live. The officer stood still, studying Camille as if he were analyzing an object, without humanity, without reason. He stepped closer, lowered his head, and whispered, but his voice was clear enough to pierce the stifling air. "You think the title of lieutenant colonel will save you from this? You are nobody here. You are just a black woman in the wrong place at the wrong time, with the wrong attitude." Camille blinked slowly, as if taking in every word he said, every gesture, every pause in the room. The insult did not need to be shouted. It was the arrogant calm of his voice that made it all the more revolting. "Do you know the one thing that tires me?" she said, her voice low, but each syllable was as hard as tempered steel. He raised his eyebrows, half smiling contemptuously. "Not the insult, not the cell, but the repetition. The same old script I've seen since I was 8. She took a breath, not to hide her emotion, but to keep it straight. Police abuse, no cameras, no one to speak up, and the victim is forced to stay silent, to survive. His hand froze at his waist, not because he was offended, but because Camille wasn't reacting the way he expected. He moved forward, bent down again, trying to penetrate deeper, like an experienced interrogator in a shady investigation. If you're smart, you'll know when to be quiet. No one's coming to save you here. No one's coming. Camille turned her head very slowly. Her gaze stopped in the most terrifying place for any abuser, right in the middle of his eyes. No avoidance, no weakness. You're wrong, she said. I don't need anyone to save me. Really? Because I've never been in this place without a witness. A slow silence spread between them. He straightened, his eyes narrowing as if analyzing the truth of her words. What do you mean? Camille tilted her head slightly, her gaze leaving his face and returning to the corner of the wall where the camera should have been. That look was the answer. He followed, looking up at the wall, then back at her, and then doubt began to bleed into his eyes. No need to shout, no need to threaten. Just by sitting still and remembering, by the careful preparation of a soldier who never left a base without checking every detail, and by her deliberate silence, Camille began to regain control. He snorted, turned, and left the room without another word. But this time, his footsteps were not arrogant. They were heavier. Each clatter against the concrete floor sounded like he was retreating from something he had not anticipated. Camille leaned back against the wall behind her. She closed her eyes, her hands still resting on her thighs, her thumbs still pressed lightly against the fabric of her shirt, where the record button was still flashing silently in safe mode. More than 90 minutes had passed. The audio signal had reached its destination. Now, though no one knew it, the truth was alive and well, stored in a place no one here could control. And in the darkness without cameras, Camille was no longer a prisoner. She was the first witness in a series of people who would break the silence of the system. The air in the cell seemed thick. Camille sat in the corner, the neon lights on the ceiling making her skin pale. But her eyes, they were bright. Not in an arrogant way. Not in a defiant way. In a way that had seen too much to be surprised. And in that eerie silence, the old memories rose, uninvited, but powerful, as if shining a flashlight into the cracks in her mind. She was 14 that year, summer in Atlanta. The sun was so hot it cracked the asphalt. The afternoons were endless, with the constant whirring of ceiling fans and the echoes of kids throwing basketballs from the neighbors' backyards. Her brother, Malik, was 17. Dark brown, thin, with a sweet smile and a strange habit of always wearing a hoodie, even when it was hot enough to fry eggs outside. He loved math, loved computers, dreamed of being an engineer. And Camille. She still believed that the world was fair if she studied well, behaved, and didn't cause trouble. That day, Malik stood in front of the small grocery store down the street, waiting for his friend. Just waiting. Doing nothing. Camille remembered it clearly because she had just come home from extra classes, holding a sweaty math book in her hand, and was about to ask him out for dinner. She had just crossed the street when, shocked brakes. The police car doors opened. 2 white officers stepped out. No cursing. No shouting. Just looked at Malik as if he were a foreign object, as if he were doing something wrong by his very presence. "What are you doing here?" one asked, his hand already on his belt. Malik lifted his hand from his pocket, slowly, smiling wryly. "I'm waiting for a friend. It's nothing." The answer was too polite, too obedient, but meaningless. Before he could finish, someone approached. Hands pushed Malik against the brick wall. A pull at the collar of his hoodie. A twist. Arms forced behind him. Worst. Camille stood there, mouth agape, unable to form words. Malik didn't scream. He just said quietly, repeating like a prayer, "Baby, it's okay. Don't yell. I didn't do anything wrong." They put handcuffs on his hands. The reason? Suspicious behavior in an area with a history of violence. Camille remembered every word as if it had been branded in red on her memory. No one asked for papers. No one looked at the cameras. No one called family. Her brother was taken away in a patrol car, held for 6 hours. No charges, no apologies. When her parents arrived at the police station, They didn't make a fuss. Her father just handed over the papers, signed a few things, and took his son back, like it was a library checkout procedure. That night, Malik sat down to dinner, his hands still shaking slightly, his eyes fixed on his plate. No one mentioned it, but Camille, she didn't forget, never. She remembered the look in Malik's eyes afterward, the look of a child beginning to understand that dreams aren't for everyone. Back in the present, in the dark cell, Camille opened her eyes. Her breathing was steady. Her heart was beating steadily. It was the memory that had taught her since her teenage years. Politeness doesn't protect you. Righteousness doesn't stop tyranny. And the truth is always overlooked unless it's backed by evidence. She had been silent when Malik was taken away. She was too young, too scared, too helpless. But today, she was no longer the 14-year-old girl standing in the middle of the street, her book falling from her hand. Today, she is Camille Ransom, 42 years old, an Army lieutenant colonel, an Iraq war survivor, someone who knows the rules, understands the tactics, and most importantly, has been preparing for this moment for 28 years. And this time she will not be silent, not because she wants revenge, but because she has sworn to herself, to Malik, to all those who have been silenced, that she will not let it happen again in the dark. Not again. As the years passed, Camille still didn't understand why the memory of that summer was so vivid. It wasn't because it was so hot. It wasn't because the sirens sliced through the air like knives. It wasn't because the shadow of the police car loomed over her brother. It was because when it all came crashing down, no one spoke. No passerby stepped forward to say, "That boy didn't do anything wrong." No one asked, "Why is he handcuffed?" People looked and looked away. Camille used to think, they must be scared. They must not know. But the older she got, the more she understood. They knew. They were just used to the silence. And that familiarity, it was the cruelest thing of all. The night Malik was brought home, Dad sat in the backyard smoking. He didn't say anything, just quiet. His eyes looked far away. His hands shook slightly. Camille sat down next to him and asked quietly, "Dad, why did they do that to you?" He didn't answer right away. After a while, his voice was hoarse, not looking at her. Because sometimes just being born with a skin color that people don't like is enough. Camille bit her lip, but she still asked, "So, I didn't do anything wrong. Why didn't I talk back to them?" Dad sighed. The sigh of a man who had lived through the 60s and 70s in the American South, who had been pushed out of restaurants, who had been called words no one should have to listen to, who had bowed his head to keep his job raising his children. Because sometimes you have to know when to be right to survive. Those words haunted Camille throughout her teenage years. She was a good student. She followed all the rules. She was never late. She never talked back to her teachers. She knew, if she wanted to be considered equal, she had to be twice as good. And even if she were twice as good, she would still have her bag searched at the supermarket while her white friend wouldn't. She didn't rebel. She didn't protest. But something inside her had cracked that day, when her brother had been seen as a threat just for waiting for his friend. That crack hadn't healed. It had smoldered when Malik failed a scholarship exam because he'd been marked under investigation. It had split open when he'd applied for a job and been rejected because his legal record was questionable, even though he'd been cleared of any crimes. It had cracked every time Camille saw Malik's shoulders hunched when a police officer walked by, even though he'd done nothing. The bow of a man who had been knocked down and wasn't sure he had the right to stand up straight again. Camille couldn't change the past. She couldn't erase the night Malik was arrested. She couldn't erase the look in her mother's eyes as she watched her son return, unscathed on the outside, but broken on the inside. But she could do one thing: never let that happen to anyone else. That's why she chose the military. That's why she trained herself to be ruthlessly disciplined. That's why she learned every rule, every regulation, not to follow a pattern, but to know the limits of others, so that if anyone tried to cross that line, she would know. And pull them back, damn. Now, in a cell with no cameras, no witnesses, no compassion, Camille didn't tremble. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because that fear had been her companion since she was 14. And this time, she wasn't the one standing still. She was the one recording. Archive. Remember every look, every word, every twist of the arm, every twisted smile of power. Because if the system doesn't want evidence, she will create evidence. Because Camille knows better than anyone. Evidence is the only thing that makes the truth heard. Footsteps approached. Slow, not hurried, not heavy, but hesitant. Camille opened her eyes as a figure appeared at the end of the hallway. The white light from the overhead fluorescence elongated his figure on the cold tile floor. He was young, no older than 30. Brown skin, close-cropped military hair. His police uniform was neat, his badge gleaming. The name on his chest, Bellamy. Camille looked more closely. She had seen him when she first arrived at the station, standing behind the counter, avoiding her gaze. Now he carried a white plastic cup of water, beneath which was a folded piece of paper. Not an order, not an indictment, just a silence placed on the paper. He paused outside the bars, said nothing. Camille did not stand, did not look away from him. There was no hatred in her eyes, no anger. Only one thing made Bellamy flinch, the disappointment she didn't hide. He set the glass on the floor, just out of her reach, calculatingly polite, as if he didn't want to cross the line of interference. Camille didn't reach out. She just tilted her head, looking at his face as if searching for an answer. After a moment, she said. Her voice was as soft as the wind through the forest. "You know I didn't do anything wrong?" Bellamy swallowed. She continued, "You know I was detained without cause. You know the cameras were off. You know no one called. No questions, no demands. Just the truth, drawn out, layer by layer, like a bare-chested heart surgeon. No knife." Bellamy didn't deny it. He glanced at the camera hanging in the corner of the ceiling. The red light was off. "That's none of my business," he said softly, his eyes not looking directly at her. Camille smiled. Not a warm smile, but a knowing smile. She nodded. "Not your business, until someone like me gets hurt, or worse. Can't leave this cell." Silence. Camille sat still, her shoulders unmoving, her back straight. But her voice softened, like an older sister speaking to a younger sibling who had fallen. "You know, I was you once. I stood still when my brother was arrested in the middle of the street for standing in the wrong place. I thought silence was wise, a way to survive. But then I saw the consequences. So real, so long." She paused. Bellamy still said nothing, just clenched his fists. Camille continued, "I don't need you to save me. I don't need anyone to save me. I've survived for a long time. But I need you to be honest with yourself." At that, Bellamy's eyes changed. Not fear, not anger, but shame. A kind of shame that only comes when you're stripped of your own skin. He left after that. No promises, no commitments. Just a glass of water, and a feeling as heavy as a rock in his chest. Camille closed her eyes. She knew he wouldn't sleep tonight, and she hoped, without him being a hero, that next time when he saw injustice, maybe he wouldn't turn away. Because real change isn't about tearing things down. It's about people who know what's wrong, not being able to stay silent. Time in the cell did not pass as it did elsewhere. It was thick, drawn out, suffocatingly silent. There was no clock, no natural light, only the flickering of fluorescent lights and the musty smell of the old cement floor. Camille sat with her back against the pale gray wall, her eyes fixed on the bars, not waiting for someone to save her, but to witness every face that passed by, every figure that hurried by, every pair of eyes that avoided her, every expectant glance. And then, finally, footsteps appeared. Not hurried, not heavy, but hesitant. A pair of police shoes, black, shiny, stopped in front of cell number 3, in front of Camille. He was young, about 28, 29, warm brown skin, tall, stocky. His police uniform was new and neat. The name was clearly embroidered on the left chest. Bellamy. Camille looked up, expressionless. He looked back, then away. Not in fear, but in shame. In his hands were a plastic cup of water and a folded piece of paper. He set it down on the floor, inches from the bars, and said nothing. Camille didn't move. She just looked at his face, her eyes as cold as a knife, revealing the truth. "You know I did nothing wrong," she said. Her voice was painfully calm. Bellamy looked up. The words weren't an accusation. They were an identification. That Camille had seen him, not just as a man in uniform, but as a man who knew right from wrong, but chose to remain silent. She continued slowly. "You know the ceiling camera was off. You know no one called to report my car as suspicious. You know I was arrested for no reason." Silence. Bellamy swallowed. He didn't protest. He didn't defend himself. Just looked down like a student who had just been caught cheating. Camille didn't blame him, didn't raise her voice. She tilted her head, looked at him closely, and said, "I don't need you to defend me. I don't need to be saved. I crossed the Syrian border, saved my comrades from an ambush. I know what it means to survive." A pause. "I just need you to be honest with yourself." Bellamy didn't move. But Camille saw it. His hands clenched, his shoulders stiffened. His heart was screaming, though he hadn't said a word. She looked straight at him. Her eyes were no longer cold, sad. "You know," she said softly, "I was you." Bellamy looked up, surprised. "I was silent when my brother was arrested, just waiting for a friend outside the grocery store. I didn't say anything. I was scared. I was a kid. But that silence, I carry it with me to this day." Camille's voice dropped, shaking slightly, not with fear, but with pain. "My brother used to dream of being an engineer. After that day, he never dreamed of anything else. Every time he saw a police car, he curled up like he was about to be beaten." She paused. She looked at Bellamy and asked a simple question, but one that felt like a nail to her heart. "Have you ever watched someone get trampled and said to yourself, 'As long as it's not you, just keep quiet'? Have you ever said nothing and then couldn't sleep well?" Bellamy turned away. Camille didn't need him to answer. She knew. She knew by the wetness in her eyes, the slight shaking in her hands, and the barely concealed shortness of breath. "Captain, I don't hate you, Marcus," she said, calling him by his name for the first time. "It's because I understand you that I'm telling you this." He turned back, eyes wide. Camille looked at him. No anger, no resentment, just tired faith. "You're not a bad person," she said, "but if you keep quiet, you'll be no different from them." "Captain." A longer silence fell between them. There was no sound except the hum of the air conditioner in the ceiling. Finally, Bellamy took a step back. He opened his mouth. His voice was hoarse, like someone who'd just run a long distance. I was scared." Camille nodded. "I was. I thought if I spoke up, I'd lose my job, lose my safety, be hated." He didn't reply, but his hands clenched, his fingers white. She leaned forward, her eyes bright. "But I'll tell you the truth, Marcus. It's easy to be afraid of losing your job. But living your whole life knowing you're silent when you should be speaking up, that's what kills you inside." Bellamy didn't say another word. He just bent down, gently pushing the glass of water toward the bars. His eyes were moist but brighter, as if something had been washed away. He stood up, took a deep breath. "Thank you," he said. Then he turned and walked away, not looking back. Camille watched him walk down the hall. His back was straighter. His steps were surer. And she knew. Maybe not today. Maybe not tomorrow. But he would come back. Not to apologize, but to choose again. Camille sat down, her back against the wall, her hands still swollen from the tight handcuffs. She closed her eyes, not to rest, but to listen again to the voice that had just come from a man who had been silent for too long. In a place where there were only people in uniform but no conscience, she had just seen the most precious thing. Conscience alive. Camille still sat in the cold cell, her back against the damp cement wall. No one else came. No more hurried footsteps. The room seemed to have forgotten that anyone was inside. Only the fluorescent lights flickered overhead, tired as if they wanted to be turned off so they wouldn't have to witness it anymore. Time blurred. In prison, time wasn't measured in hours. It was measured in echoes. The sound of handcuffs clicking against bars, the sound of boots stomping on tiles, and the sound of a heart pounding when hearing a voice that didn't need to be shouted, but was still enough to scare others. And then he came. No warning, no knocking. The dry click of the lock opening, like metal biting into metal. The cell door opened. He walked in. No name, no badge, no number. No introduction. No greeting. Nothing but the arrogance that he had the right. Over 6 feet tall, pale skin, square face, deep, cold eyes. The uniform was still there, but there was no insignia. He belonged to the stratum where power did not require paper. Camille did not stand. She had seen too many of his kind on the battlefield. Men who believed that the silence of others was an affirmation of their right to rule. He looked at her. Not a look of communication, but of assessment, as if he were considering her as something to be discarded or kept. Then he stepped forward. Not quickly, but surely. Stopping in front of her, he bent down, his hands on his knees. His voice was low, his nose stretching out the last word like a snake. "I heard you were an officer." Camille raised her head, her eyes cold. There was no fear, no avoidance, only contempt tempered by reason. "Lieutenant Colonel," she corrected. "Camille Ransom," he chuckled. Not happily. The laugh of someone who knows he has a rope around someone else's neck. "Here," he said. "Ranks mean nothing. Do you understand?" She didn't answer, and he leaned closer, his breath smelling of stale cigarettes and cold coffee. "Here, you're nobody." Camille had heard that before. She was 15, in a supermarket, when the security guard kicked her out on suspicion of theft without proof. She had kept quiet then, gritted her teeth to avoid embarrassing her mother. But now she was no longer 15. "I am a citizen of this country," she said slowly, each word hammered in. "And you are breaking the law," he chuckled. Then he straightened up. He circled her like a predator. "I don't see anyone here recording," he said, glancing up at the dead-end camera in the corner of the ceiling. "I don't see anyone standing guard, and I certainly don't see your lawyer." Then he stopped behind her, and for a split second, Camille felt a heavy pressure on her shoulder. His hand, placed deliberately as if to remind her that with just the slightest pressure, he could make her lose her balance, her control, her dignity. But Camille didn't move. "You know," she said, "you're not the first person to try to intimidate me in a closed room with no cameras. But I assure you," she tilted her head, her eyes on the corner of the ceiling, "there are other eyes watching. And I'm not talking about God." He stopped. Even without saying anything, Camille sensed it. For the first time, he hesitated. He stepped back in front, crossed his arms, and stood looking at her. "You think you're special? You think you're the perfect victim who will be saved by the media, the military, or social media?" Camille didn't react. He stepped closer, bent down, and looked her straight in the eye. "You have no one. No evidence, no cameras. I can make you disappear from here like you never existed. You're just a black guy who stopped his car where he shouldn't have." Camille was silent. Then she smiled. A thin, razor-sharp smile. "Then it's a shame for you. Because you picked the wrong person." Bah. A beep sounded from the phone in Camille's inside pocket, where she had hidden the mini recorder since she was put in the police car. Every time he opened his mouth, his every word was recorded. The sound, the tone, the intonation. Camille tilted her head. "You think you're here alone with me, but in fact, every word you say you've long since left this room." His eyes changed. For the first time, he was truly frightened. Not frightened by Camille, but because for the first time, he realized there was something he couldn't control. "Pass." Camille stood up. Though her wrists still hurt from the handcuffs, her posture did not waver. "You have the power today," she said. "But I have time, and the truth, and there are people out there who are beginning to hear the voices of people like me." She looked straight at him, her eyes not filled with hatred, but with a verdict. "And when that time comes, you will no longer have the darkness to hide in." He turned and walked out, but this time, his steps were unsteady. He no longer had the straight back that usually belonged to someone accustomed to winning. Camille sat down, silent, her hands clasped to her chest. Her heart was beating fast, not because of fear, but because she knew the coming battle would no longer be between one person and another. It would be between the truth and a system designed to conceal it. It was just after dawn when Camille Ransom was released. No applause, no apologies, no escort. Just a female officer quietly placing her purse, phone, and old hairpin back on the dull aluminum table. Camille stood there, unhurried. She looked at each item, as if checking her identity after a night of deprivation. Small, seemingly meaningless things, but proof that she was still there. A woman, an officer, a mother, a person, not a number marked overnight. No one thanked her for her cooperation. No one looked her in the eye. All bowed their heads, as if to see her meant to see themselves. But just when Camille thought it was over, a thin piece of paper was handed to her. A civil summons. Content. Impacting public safety. Parking in a residential area while acting suspiciously and failing to comply with a request from law enforcement. Camille clenched the paper in her hand, but her eyes didn't blink. No surprise, no shock, just a deep sense of disappointment. So familiar it was almost numbing. A trap, a last-ditch move. When they couldn't put out the fire, they tried to twist the story. No one saw her being pulled from the car. No one heard her say, "I cooperated." And now no one needed proof. All they needed was the word of an officer. Camille stepped outside, the early morning sunlight hitting her face. For the first time in a long night, the morning breeze that blew across the back of her neck didn't make her shiver. It steadied her. Her SUV was still parked where it had been, not towed away. Another paradox. If she had truly been a disturbance, the car would have been sealed long ago. She opened the door. The central screen lit up. A line of text appeared on a blue background. Video transferred. The evidence had been sent. Automatic, secure, uneditable. Camille's eyes lit up. Not with victory, but with a much greater sense that justice had found a place. She called her lawyer. It was none other than Cynthia Duval, a black woman in her 60s, with silver hair, known for her relentless pursuit of justice, a legal veteran who had once forced the police departments of 2 states to bow and apologize publicly. Cynthia heard the whole story and was silent for almost a minute. Then she said, evenly, firmly, "Camille, you're not here to be forgiven. You're here to expose." And with that one sentence, Camille knew she was not alone. The day of the trial came quickly. The Fulton County courtroom was packed, but silent. There were reporters. There were citizens. There were students sitting in the back row, probably there for the school's Watching Justice program. But no one laughed. No one joked. Everyone looked at Camille as she entered. Her black suit had no epaulets, no medals, but it was her face, sober, quiet, but determined, that held the courtroom's attention. At the plaintiff's table was Scott Whitaker, the officer who had pulled her from the car. His gaze was no longer as defiant as it had been that night. It was now evasive, dull. Not for Camille, but for what he knew was waiting behind her. Cynthia Duval stood. No tricks, no drumming. Just quietly opened a small USB and plugged it into the court system. The big screen lit up. Camille's car's internal camera footage appeared. Red and blue lights flashing in the distance. Whitaker's voice. "I don't need a reason. You're suspicious just sitting there." The audio was clear. A man's voice. A coercive voice. No reason, no warning. The courtroom wasn't noisy, but the weight of the recording made everyone hold their breath. An old woman in the back tilted her head and whispered, her voice shaking. "Just like my granddaughter last year. She got arrested for wearing a hoodie." A young man squeezed his wife's hand. A student in the back of the class swallowed, and at that moment, everyone understood. Whitaker had nothing more to say. The young attorney representing the police department, smartly dressed, smooth as butter, had to back away. Because the truth was undeniable. Every sentence in the video, every breath, every step that pulled Camille out of the driver's seat, all spoke for her. Cynthia stepped into the middle of the room, her voice warm. Warm but cold as tempered steel. "My client is not asking for special privileges. She is not asking for forgiveness. She is not asking for a symbol. She is asking for one thing, the justice that everyone deserves." The judge, a white man in his 60s, was thoughtful. He took off his glasses. He did not speak immediately, not because he did not know the decision, but because he knew too well. This decision would have an aftertaste. Camille sat still. No begging, no holding hands. She just waited, and no matter what, she knew. She did not bow her head. The courtroom was silent. All eyes were on Judge Barrow, the one who had the power to pronounce sentence. He sat still, his hands clasped together, his eyes fixed on the file before him. Then he raised his head. After reviewing the direct evidence, the irrefutable audio recordings, and the video from the Department of Defense's security equipment, he paused, his voice lowering. The court finds that the arrest of Lieutenant Colonel Camille Ransom is unlawful. All charges against her are hereby completely and permanently dismissed. The sound of the gavel on the table rang out 3 times, hard, decisive, unlocking a truth that had been locked away for too long. Camille did not smile. She did not shed a tear. She simply nodded, a nod of dignity and peace. But what shook the courtroom was not the verdict. It was what happened next. Chatson. As the plaintiff's attorney stood up to excuse himself, a small door at the side of the courtroom suddenly opened. A young police officer entered. His uniform was new. His black shoes were shiny and not worn. In his hands were a file and a personal phone. It was none other than Officer Malcolm Green, the one who had appeared in the cell that night, who had quietly placed a glass of water next to Camille, who had just disappeared without a word. He walked straight to the witness stand. No name was called. No procedure was followed. But his eyes, as steady as if he were standing in the middle of a battlefield. The judge looked at him, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Who are you? And what do you think you're doing?" Malcolm squeezed the phone lightly in his hand. His voice rang out, calm, unwavering. "Your Honor, I am a police officer with the County Sheriff's Department, and I am a first-hand witness to what happened the night Colonel Ransom was arrested." The courtroom stirred. Whitaker stood up. His voice choked. "No, he can't!" The judge raised his hand to interrupt. "Silence, Mr. Whitaker. I will decide that." He turned to Malcolm. "Continue." Matt. Malcolm slowly flipped open his phone. The screen displayed a recording with the title, "Recording Whitaker 23:14 p.m. He looked up. "That night, I was standing in the West Hall when I heard this conversation. I activated the emergency recording, and I kept quiet. Until today." A tap. And Whitaker's voice rang out, cold, self-satisfied. "I don't need a reason. Just sitting in the car is suspicious enough. Cuff her. Take her in. No report needed." The courtroom shuddered. The air seemed to be sucked out of the room. Cynthia Duval just smiled slightly. "Thank you, Officer Green." Malcolm did not leave the stand. He continued, this time not reading the statement. He spoke in the same voice as a man who had just been unchained from fear. "Your Honor, I was there. I saw how Lieutenant Ransom was dragged from the car. She didn't resist, not at all. I stood there, doing nothing." He swallowed. His eyes were red. "I was taught that the police protect the people, but I also learned that silence sometimes is complicity." He looked at Camille, who sat still, unjudging, just silently watching him, like a mirror reflecting him back into the person he once believed he was not brave enough to be. "And today, I can no longer remain silent." "Chum." The judge leaned back in his chair, his hands lightly rubbing his chin. He nodded. "Your testimony will be entered into the record." Whitaker was speechless now. His face was pale. Beads of sweat dripped from his temples. No one looked at him as a colleague anymore. No one defended him. No one denied him anymore. But the final blow came from the most unexpected place. A witness had been called by the plaintiffs earlier. Angela Holloway, a black woman who lived in the same neighborhood, who had said, "I heard a strange noise coming from her car." She stood up, asking permission to speak again. The room held its breath. She looked straight at Camille, her eyes hesitant, her voice shaking but clear. "I lied." The room was stunned. "I was threatened by someone in the police department. They said if I didn't testify that there was music coming from the car, I could be subject to a security check. I have a teenage son at home." Her voice was choked. "I was scared. I betrayed Ms. Ransom. But I can't live with that anymore." She turned to Whitaker, then looked straight at the judge. "I accept the consequences of my false testimony, but I don't want to be silent anymore." And in that moment, the whole game of manipulation and lies collapsed. Camille didn't need to prove anything more. The truth had spoken. The system had eaten itself. And the one who had been the victim now became the beacon. Camille sat alone by the window that morning. The coffee steamed in her hand, no longer a habit to stay awake, but a quiet moment to commune with herself. The text from Cynthia's lawyer arrived earlier than usual. Whitaker, indefinite suspension. The police department is under internal review. The Independent Civilian Oversight Board will be discussed at next week's City Council meeting. We lit the fuse. They can't put it out. Camille finished reading. She nodded. No smile. No sigh. Just a look as calm as the surface of a lake. But underneath it, a wave was rising. They had wanted her to be quiet. They had thought she would retreat quietly, save face. But they were wrong. Camille Ransom did not represent resentment. She represents a rebirth of faith in justice, not in rhetoric, but in action, grounded in real pain. 3 weeks later, Camille made her first public appearance since the lawsuit. Not at a ceremony, not at a glittering speech, but in a modest town hall meeting with activists, community leaders, and people who had been wrongly arrested, shortchanged, or simply made invisible. She wore simple clothes, a white shirt, gray khakis, no military insignia, carrying only a briefcase, not evidence, but a policy proposal. Inside, an independent community surveillance system, mandatory storage of personal camera footage and public disclosure, a non-anonymous reporting process, and most important, an investigative panel made up of citizens, not just police. There was no applause when she spoke, just silence, but a listening silence. She ended with a simple sentence. I'm not here to be celebrated. I'm here for those who can't stand in this position anymore, and for our children. Children who deserve to grow up in a world where their skin color doesn't determine who is believed and who is taken. After the press conference, a boy of about 10 approached her. Lightly curled hair, a white t-shirt, a face that Camille found painfully familiar. He looked up. Didn't ask for an autograph. Didn't say a platitude. He just said quietly, but loud enough for Camille to hear, "You make me think. Someday I can do the right thing." Camille knelt down, not to listen, but to see him as her equal. She put her hand on his shoulder, her eyes moist, but her voice firm. "You didn't have to wait until later. You started already, as soon as you believed the right thing could happen." And outside the conference room, someone else was waiting. No one on television, no one to greet, but perhaps the one who had changed the game. Malcolm Green. His police uniform was still there, but the badge was different now, with a small silver ribbon attached. Honorable whistleblower. He said nothing. He just nodded to Camille. A nod not of apology, but of recognition of a debt of gratitude, to his own conscience. Camille smiled. "How are you?" Malcolm said for the first time in weeks. Now. No one honored Camille. No medal, no glass trophy with his name on it. But to those present, and to those who had been treated as she was, Camille had become something more precious than a title. A living testimony. A reminder that justice doesn't need to be shouted. It just needs someone brave enough to stand up at the right moment. The story of Camille Ransom doesn't end with applause. It ends with action. And a new generation will grow up, go to school, work, live, not under the fear of being arrested just because of who they are. Camille stepped out of the building. The midday light fell on her hair, soft as a prayer. She knew there would be other times. There would be battles not told. There would be names not defended. But now she was no longer alone. Because in the end, the truth, when recorded, when heard, when spoken, will never die. Are you angry? Do you feel like you or someone you love could be considered suspicious simply because of the color of your skin, the way you dress, or the indifferent look from someone holding handcuffs? If so, don't be silent. Please like this video to stand with Camille. Let her know she's not alone. Comment below to write how you feel, to express your anger, or simply, I support Camille Ransom. And finally, if you believe that justice shouldn't be a privilege, it should be a human right, subscribe now. Because here, we'll continue to tell real stories, stories that others want to hide. We don't tell stories to create drama. We tell to spark an awakening, to shine light into the dark corners that, for too long, have been too hidden to look at. Camille did not fall. She rose, and we must stand with her. Don't let the voice of conscience be drowned out by silence, because when one person speaks, a generation will no longer bow.